Our education system is not used as a backdoor means of immigration. It is there for research and education, not a backdoor means of getting permanent residence in this country.
Right, we come to Chris Elmore.
Number 8, sir.
Because that's still me, I think. Mr. Speaker, giving police the resources that they need to police local communities and fight crime remains a priority for this government. We have delivered on our commitment to recruit 20,000 additional police officers. Indeed, we are over that. Decisions about how they are deployed are, of course, a discussion and a decision for chief constables and police and crime commissioners and mayors who are responsible to their local communities.
Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The legacy of cuts from this government has left police forces across England and Wales with a £3.2 billion cash shortfall. 6,000 frontline officers are now being taken away from frontline policing duties to complete the roles of former police staff. So can the Minister, can the Home Secretary in fact, start to acknowledge the Tory cuts? How is he going to rectify it and get more frontline police back onto our neighbourhoods across the United Kingdom?
Well, as I say, the decision for how a police force balances its important back office roles and its frontline policing roles is rightly one for the Chief Constable. We have given additional resource. We have delivered on our commitment to have more police officers. Of course, we are looking at police funding formulas to ensure that they remain well-resourced, but there are more police officers now, over 20,000 more, in fact 20,947 additional officers in England and Wales. That will ensure that there are more police on the front line.
The Minister Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my honourable friend says, that to this day we are still feeling the devastating impact of the Tories' decision to cut 20,000 police officers. Ministers, indeed the Home Secretary, seem to expect credit for desperately trying to reverse it, but the National Police Chiefs Council were right, weren't they? The efforts at reversal have moored 6,000 warranted officers in roles traditionally filled by civilians. Again, we've heard from the Home Secretary that we've never had it so good, but there are still 10,000 fewer neighbourhood police. Why won't they match our commitment for 13,000 more police and PCSOs out on the beat?
Match it.
Mr. Speaker, unless they actually have a plan for paying for those figures, it is just empty rhetoric. The simple truth of the matter is there are record numbers of police officers in police forces around the country. They have indeed, including Essex Police, who I visited this morning. They have never had more police officers than they currently have got. It is right for chief constables to decide how to deploy those police officers, but again, unless we hear from them a plan of paying for those additional officers, then I just won't trust their figures.
Richard Thompson.
Number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been mindful of the need to balance the impacts on individual sectors with economic growth and the needs of the labour market with the need to reduce levels of immigration. As part of our policy development, we undertook analytical work across government which supports the decisions we made. A regulatory impact assessment will be developed in due course.
Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Director of Universities Scotland, Alistair Sim, has expressed concerns that changes to the government's visa's income threshold could affect the ability of universities to attract global talent. Now, international students and academics make a contribution in excess of £5 billion annually to the Scottish economy. Now, if this government, as it says, recognises the contributions of international students and academics, why are they introducing a policy which threatens to prevent future cohorts of those international students and academics from making a similar contribution into the future?
Well, I believe that individuals will still be able to make a valid contribution in the years ahead, but in a sustainable and managed way. There are no immediate plans to introduce further exemptions to the increased salary threshold, but the salary discounts remain in place presently. We will continue to engage as these measures are introduced, and I would also just say that there are opportunities domestically for recruitment, and I think we ought to be at every opportunity trying to support domestic recruitment wherever we can.
Number 12, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Work is continuing to update the funding formula, and I'll update the House as soon as I am able to. But the House should be aware that next year, 2024-25, police and crime commissioners funding frontline police will see their budgets increased by up to £922 million, an increase of around about 6%.
Mr. Strappin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's cross-party agreement that the current funding formula is unfair for police in Bedfordshire, with the Conservatives' own PCC acknowledging that there is simply no meat left on the bone for local police. My constituents are fed up of being told they've never had it so good or fobbed off with one-off grants. Will the Minister commit to a date to finally deliver a fair funding formula for my communities?
Well, what I'll commit to, as far as the people of Bedfordshire are concerned, is an increase next year, 24-25, an increase in funding of £10.2 million. That's an extra 6.5% compared to this year. And they also have 1,455 police officers. That is about 200 more than the Bedfordshire Police Force have ever had at any time in their history.
Fuller.
Unusual to hear from two Bedfordshire MPs when it comes back to the police funding formula, because this goes all the way back to the last Labour government. But there is cross-party view in Bedfordshire that Bedfordshire police are underfunded. So will my friend the Minister agree to meet with all the MPs of Bedfordshire so we can press the case for continued funding, increases in funding for Bedfordshire police?
Well, I'm always happy to meet my honourable friend to discuss these issues. As I say, Bedfordshire Police will receive an extra £10.2 million next year, an increase of about 6.5%, which I'm sure will be welcome up and down the county. But of course, yes, I'm happy to meet my honourable friend whenever he would like.
I presume that's all of them, was it, Minister? Ferriol Clark, Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, not listening to police forces raising serious concerns about a funding formula and about how it's affecting, how it's limiting the ability to tackle town centre crime. The British Retail Consortium report that there are more than 850 acts of violence or abuse against shop workers every single day. Mr. Speaker, everyone has a right to feel safe at work. So when will the Home Secretary accept that retail crime is out of control and accept Labour's plan to introduce a new law to protect retail workers from violence and actually stand up for shop workers?
Well, theft offences, of course, are down by 47% since 2010. But we have crime survey figures. But we have recently launched a retail crime action plan where police are committing to prioritise attendance at the incidents of retail crime and always follow reasonable lines of inquiry in relation to shoplifting, assaults against shop workers and other forms of offending as well. In addition to that, we legislated in the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act in various ways.
Question 13, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will answer question 13 and 16 together. This government recognises the impact of neighbourhood crime. It's the crime that most affects people's confidence, both that of individuals, businesses and communities. The strategic response to this is evidence-based and targeted, and getting policing right in this area is incredibly important for maintaining community confidence.
Then Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've seen for myself how successful the government's Safer Streets Fund was in Barnstaple, and I'm delighted it's to be extended into Ilfracombe this year. Can my right honourable friend ensure that councils have the funding to help support these schemes?
I thank my honourable friend for highlighting this point. I'm very proud of the fact that since 2010, neighbourhood crime is down by 51% because of the kind of interventions that she has highlighted. I can reassure her that we will continue to look at what works, we will continue to fund and support, and we will continue to make every effort to drive down neighbourhood crime even further.
Savage up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Police numbers across Devon and Cornwall are at record levels and they deserve our praise. In a recent survey, my constituents in East Devon said tackling neighbourhood crime is an absolute priority. That's ranging from burglaries to thefts from vehicles. Can my right honourable friend outline what progress this Conservative government has made on cracking down on neighbourhood crime?
Well, I'm very pleased that his local community are feeling the positive impact of the decisions we made. And since coming into government, we have seen serious violence reduced by 26% since the start of this Parliament. We have also seen neighbourhood crime down by 27% since the start of this Parliament. 36% reduction in domestic burglary, 18% reduction in vehicle-related theft, 61% decrease in robbery, 18% decrease in vehicle-related theft. We've reduced homicide by 15%. We have seen action on drugs, and we are committed to go.
I've got the same to the Minister. Please, you were very slow at the beginning, and you're not going to be slow at the end, I'm sure. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, I visited 5 co-op stores. Every single one of them had a daily experience of theft, one losing £35,000 worth of goods over 6 months, and staff experiencing assaults. In the light that Labour are introducing 13,000 more community policing and retail crime law, what is the Minister really doing? Because clearly his plan isn't working.
Mr. Speaker, we have a retail crime action plan. We have ensured that assaults against shop workers is an aggregating factor, and we have made it clear to police forces across the country that we expect them to take action on neighbourhood crime like this, and that they will pursue every reasonable line of inquiry. We are absolutely determined to drive down retail crime.
Question 17, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The objective of the Safer Streets Fund and the Safety of Women at Night Fund is to enhance public safety in a direct and targeted way, neighbourhood by neighbourhood. Since 2020, the Government has invested £150 million across the 2 funds, and the evaluation of round 1 of the Safer Streets Fund, which was published in January of last year, showed that the investment was boosting trust in the police and making communities feel safer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister justify the Government cut of 38% of funding for projects to reduce violence against women and girls in Merseyside? And one project will have to cease.
Well, what I can tell the Honourable Lady is that under the Safer Streets Fund, £3.9 million has been allocated to Merseyside, including a project to St Helens Town Centre. Let me remind her very gently of what it's funding. It's gone towards lighting, signage, improvement to taxi ranks, and one of the most radical measures of all is that it provides women with a free taxi service home, where the Safer Streets Fund will reimburse the taxi driver for the money they would otherwise not have received, so that a woman doesn't have to find herself standing at a windy bus stop or walking home.
Shadow Minister Alex Davies-Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We welcome the Safer Streets Fund, which will go some way to support the nighttime economy, which has been badly hit over 14 years. The Government's efforts to tackle spiking are also being completely undermined by the Home Secretary. Spiking is a serious and devastating offence. So why did the Home Secretary therefore think it was appropriate to joke about spiking his own wife? And can he confirm exactly how many drops of Rohypnol does he consider to be illegal?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. I think it has been widely reported that the Home Secretary was making a joke about not being good enough for his wife. The point is, we are the first government who has actually done something about spiking. It's not a new offence. The measures to change the statutory provisions in the Offences Against the Person Act could have been taken by the last Labour government. And actually the reason we've sought to clarify it in law is because we don't think that enough victims are coming forward. And the reason that we don't think there are enough prosecutions is because the time lag in getting effective toxicology reports, which is why we're investing so much money in rapid drinks testing kits, so that hopefully we'll be able to get the tests done on site, on the night, and get more of these offenders behind bars.
We now come to topicals. Kerry McCarthy.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, this year the Home Office will continue to build on our progress on the public priorities. A 36% fall in small boats crossings last year, 86 arrests of small boat pilots, 246 arrests of people smugglers, the biggest ever international operation resulting in 136 boat seizures, 45 outboard motors being seized. We announced the legal migration package, more than 2,000 county lines, drugs lines smashed, the introduction of the Criminal Justice Bill to give the police leaders more powers. We are relentlessly focused on delivering community safety on behalf of the British people.
Kerry McCarthy.
Now that we actually have the Home Secretary here to answer for himself, can he tell us if he is aware that the police are receiving more than 560 reports of spiking every month? And in December, the Home Office said the reason the crime is so prevalent is because it's seen as funny and a joke. How can we really have any confidence in the Home Secretary to deliver action on spiking when he himself thinks it's a joke?
Mr. Speaker, I am the Home Secretary who has actually introduced action on this. On my first week in the job, I visited Holborn Police Station to see the work of the Metropolitan Police there, tackling violence against women and girls. I made it clear to the Home Office that my priority was the protection of women and girls. I am taking action on this issue, and I'm absolutely determined to continue to do so.
Nigel Wills.
I'm sure the Home Secretary would agree that anti-extremism training in government departments is extremely important. What more can the government do to ensure it actually is training to tackle extremism and not just anti-government and party bias training?
Well, the honourable member will have seen recently a pretty extraordinary report on allegations about extremism and the failure to train properly what is going on in universities around the United Kingdom. There was one recent problematic case where they said it was very hard to define what a terrorist is. Well, I think we know what a terrorist is, the law knows what a terrorist is, and this government knows what a terrorist is, and that's exactly why we've just prescribed Hizb ut-Tahrir.
Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We welcome the prescription of Hizb ut-Tahrir. 5 more lives were tragically lost in the Channel this weekend. As criminal gangs profit from these dangerous boat crossings, it shows how vital it is to stop them. But we need the Home Office to have a grip. The Home Secretary gave no answer earlier on the 4,000 people he has lost from the Rwanda list. Can he tell us if he has also lost the 35,000 people he has removed from the asylum backlog? How many of them are still in the country?
Mr. Speaker, I join the Right Honourable Lady in expressing our sadness and condolences for those who lost their life in the Channel, reinforcing the importance of breaking the people smuggling gangs. The fact is that we are driving down the numbers of people in the backlog. We are processing applications more quickly. We are ensuring that decisions are made so that those who should not be in this country can be removed either to their own country or safe third country. That is why the Rwanda bill is so very important. That's why we'll continue working on these issues.
But returns have dropped 50% since the last Labour government, and he's still not telling us where these missing people are. He appears to have lost thousands of people who may have no right to be in the country and lost any grip at all. In the ongoing Tory asylum chaos, we've got cabinet ministers and countless ex-ministers and the deputy Tory chair all saying they oppose the Home Secretary's policy this week, a policy we know he and the Prime Minister don't even believe in. So, if the deputy Tory chair this week votes against the Home Secretary's policy, will he be sacked? Or is the Prime Minister so weak he's lost control of asylum, lost control of our borders and lost control of his own party too?
The members of Parliament on my side of the House are absolutely united in our desire, to get a grip of this issue. I am not the person who's held up a sign saying refugees welcome. I am not the person whose colleagues oppose each and every rhetorical flourish. And until the party opposite comes up with a credible plan, I will not be taking their criticism any more seriously than they deserve.
Blackburn.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sorry, I didn't hear you. The British people welcome people that come to this country and work and contribute to our economy. But those that abuse our hospitality, commit violent offences and are then sent to prison, need to be deported at the end of their sentences. So will my right honourable friend update the House on how many were deported last year and what action he's going to take to ensure that it's automatic that violent offenders leaving prison who are foreign nationals will be deported?
Mr. Speaker, we are clear that foreign criminals should be deported wherever possible. We will continue to do so. Mr. Speaker, this is in stark contrast to the calls to stop the deportation of foreign national criminals, those calls coming from the leader of the opposition and the party opposite. My honourable friend will please to know that FNO returns have increased by 19% in the last 12 months.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, my Slough constituents are often having to wait months to elicit a response for their asylum or Home Office queries. So, Home Secretary, given the Conservative government's persistent failure to effectively manage the asylum system, resulting in an almost 100,000 case backlog and the excessive use of expensive hotels, does he not feel that now is the time to adopt Labour's comprehensive plan, which would end the use of expensive hotels within 12 months and significantly reduce the backlog?
Minister.
I think he means the non-existent plan, Mr. Speaker. The fact is that last year we got on and made 112,000 initial decisions. If he has specific cases that he wishes to raise with me as the Minister, I am very happy to have a look at those. But the fact is the productivity improvements that we saw last year carries through a lot of learning as we now get on and we deal with the backlog. There's a lot of positive work that's gone on there. He should recognise that point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Humberside Police now have over 800 more officers than in 2010, which obviously enables them to provide a better service to my constituents, but also crucial is top-class leadership, currently provided by Jonathan Everson, the Police Commissioner, and until recently Lee Freeman, the former Chief Constable, something I'm sure his successor will also provide. Would the Minister agree that top-class leadership is important, and what is he doing to ensure improvements to the present leadership training scheme?
Well, I join him in commending the progress Humberside Police have made, in particular under recent Chief Constable Lee Freeman. And in terms of improving leadership, of course, Lee Freeman is now one of Her Majesty's inspectors, and he can apply what he learned and then put into practice in Humberside across the whole country.
But the Chamberlain.
Mr. Speaker, on the 17th of October, the Government in the House pledged to make changes to ACRS Pathways 1 and 3. When can the House expect an update and a plan on this?
We, of course, are continuing to work very collaboratively across government in terms of the response to the situation in Afghanistan, fulfilling the commitments that we made to provide that sanctuary in the way that all of us want to see. We will come forward and say more about those efforts as soon as we're able.
Show them before it.
Heard earlier about the effectiveness of the Safer Streets Fund, and Falmouth, in my constituency where most of the students live, recently received £67,000. In addition to that, our brilliant Police and Crime Commissioner Alison Hernandez has been working with Dawn Dines, who helped successfully change the law on spiking. But can my right honourable friend demonstrate to my Truro and Falmouth constituents how these positive changes will improve conviction rates in the Devon and Cornwall area?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her question, and I congratulate her Police and Crime Commissioner for the excellent work that she's doing. She will be aware that we have amended the Offences Against the Person Act so that the offence of spiking is captured specifically and comprehensively in law, in part because we want more victims to come forward. But we are told time and again by the police that the most significant barrier to conviction is the length of time between the offence taking place and a toxicology report being received. Therefore, we are investing in rapid drink testing research so that we hope to bring the testing capacity on site.
Very much. UK Hospitality estimate that 95% of skilled worker visas that were gained last year would be lost under the new regulations. Now, that's a vital sector of my local economy in Edinburgh and for Scotland. So when will the government recognise that the revision to the salary level was not sufficient and bring it down to a reasonable level?
Well, I disagree with the honourable lady's interpretation of the situation. The fact is that we should be working in a collaborative cross-government way, particularly to support domestic employment wherever that is possible. There are comprehensive steps being taken through the Back to Work plan to help deliver on that, and there are many people here on other routes who are perfectly able to work and with the right support would be doing that, and that's precisely where we're going to focus our efforts.
Oh, that's good. Jack the Press Day.
Mr. Speaker, could I ask what steps my honourable friend is taking to provide advice to police forces across the country to help them support communities during the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas?
Well, my honourable friend is right to ask this question because sadly we've seen an absolutely vile upsurge in anti-Semitism on our streets. We've seen people who claim to be speaking out for equality and justice actually defending people who take slaves, who violate women's and girls' rights, and here in our own country who make the Jewish community feel uncomfortable. That's exactly why this government has committed £18 million to the Community Safety Trust, and very sadly we've also had to commit £7 million to academic security. Sadly, there has been a massive increase in anti-Semitism in universities as well, and we are combating all of that.
Julian Lewis.
How many times must a demonstration in the same cause be repeated week in, week out, before the well-funded organisers become liable to pay for at least part of the policing costs?
Mr. Speaker, of course, we recognise that there is legitimacy to public protest. We do also recognise that the unprecedented and unwarranted pressure that this is putting on policing around the country is having an impact on communities. My view is that the organisers have made their point. Repeating it does not strengthen their argument, and unfortunately we're also seeing some deeply distasteful people weaving themselves in amongst those protesters who are protesting on issues that they feel passionate about but whose goodwill is being abused by others.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Home Secretary urgently meet with his right honourable friend and neighbour, the member for Braintree, I think he's Braintree, sorry, I can't remember the seat. Anyway, the member whose surname is Jenkin, to speak about why it is that when the whole House passed the Public Order Act with an amendment to have safe access zones for women using abortion clinics, it's now subject to consultation which would gut that legislation. Can you meet with us urgently? It's due on the 22nd of January, and it wouldn't actually do what all MPs from this House voted for.
I will endeavour to find out the details of the point the honourable lady made. She will write to me on this issue.
Final question, Tim Watt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week the Home Secretary produced a report on safe and legal routes to comply with Section 61 of the Illegal Migration Act and the amendment I tabled last year. It's very long and generous on the existing legal routes, but can he tell me how my 16-year-old orphan from a East African country with links to the UK, who is a genuine asylum seeker, will be helped to come legally and safely to the UK by what the government has published so far?
Well, my honourable friend is, of course, a very passionate advocate on this issue. We had a conversation last week about this very point. The fact is that since 2015, we've welcomed over 500,000 people through our safe and legal routes. We are introducing the cap precisely because we want to see that generosity extended in the years ahead, but the pressures of illegal migration in particular make that very, very challenging and very difficult. But this is precisely the sort of issue that I want to study with him as we move forward with the cap, to make sure that we do continue to help the most vulnerable people from around the world, working particularly with the UNHCR and others.
That completes questions. We now come to the statement. I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to update the House on the action that we took on Thursday night against Houthi military targets in Yemen. Since the 19th of November, Iran-backed Houthis have launched over 25 illegal and unacceptable attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. And on the 9th of January, they mounted a direct attack against British and American warships. They fired on our ships and our sailors. It was the biggest attack on the Royal Navy for decades. And so we acted. We did so in self-defence, consistent with the UN Charter, and to uphold freedom of navigation, as Britain has always done. Alongside the United States, with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands, we ordered the RAF to strike 2 Houthi military facilities in Yemen. I want to be clear that these were limited strikes. They were carefully targeted at launch sites for drones and ballistic missiles to degrade the Houthis' capacity to make further attacks on international shipping. I can tell the House today that our initial assessment is that all 13 planned targets were destroyed. At the drone and cruise missile base in Barney, 9 buildings were successfully hit. A further 3 buildings were hit at Abs Airfield, along with a cruise missile launcher caught in the open. We have seen no evidence thus far of civilian casualties, which we took great care to avoid. I know the whole House will join me in paying tribute to the incredible bravery and professionalism of all our servicemen and women. The need to maximise the security and effectiveness of the operation meant that it was not possible to bring this matter to the House in advance. But we took care to brief members before the strikes took place, including you, of course, Mr. Speaker, and the Leader of the Opposition, and I've come to the House at the earliest possible opportunity. Mr. Speaker, I do not take decisions on the use of force lightly. That's why I stress that this action was taken in self-defence. It was limited, not escalatory. It was a necessary and proportionate response to a direct threat to UK vessels and therefore to the UK itself. And Mr. Speaker, let me be absolutely clear why the Royal Navy is in the Red Sea. They are there as part of Operation Prosperity Guardian, protecting freedom of navigation as a fundamental tenet of international law. The Houthis' attack on international shipping have put innocent lives at risk. They have held 1 crew hostage for almost 2 months, and they are causing growing economic disruption. Global commerce cannot operate under such conditions. Containers and tankers are having to take a 5,000-mile detour around the Cape of Good Hope. That pushes up prices and imperils the passage of goods, foods and medicines that the British people and others rely on. We have attempted to resolve this through diplomacy. After numerous international calls for the attacks to stop, a coalition of countries gave the Houthis a clear and unambiguous warning 2 weeks ago. Last week, the UN Security Council passed a resolution condemning the attacks and highlighting the right of nations to defend their vessels and preserve freedom of navigation. Yet, the Houthis continued on their reckless path. Mr. Speaker, we shouldn't fall for their malign narrative that this is about Israel and Gaza. They target ships from around the world. We continue to work towards a sustainable ceasefire in Gaza and to get more aid to civilians. We also continue to support a negotiated settlement in Yemen's civil war. But I want to be very clear that this action is completely unrelated to those issues. It is a direct response to the Houthis' attacks on international shipping. And we should also recognise the risks of inaction. It would weaken international security and the rule of law, further damage freedom of navigation in the global economy, and send a dangerous message that British vessels and British interests are fair game. And there is another point here, which is often overlooked. The Houthis' attack risks worsening the dire humanitarian situation in Yemen itself. The UK helps to feed around 100,000 Yemenis every month, with aid arriving via the very sea routes that the Houthis have in their sights. So, Mr. Speaker, the threats to shipping must cease. Illegally detained vessels and crews must be released, and we remain prepared to back our words with actions. But, Mr. Speaker, dealing with this threat does not detract from our other international commitments. Rather, it strengthens our determination to uphold fundamental UN principles. If our adversaries think that they can distract us from helping Ukraine by threatening international security elsewhere, they could not be more wrong. On Friday, I travelled to Kyiv to meet President Zelensky and address the Ukrainian parliament. I took a message from this House to the Rada that we will stand with Ukraine today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes. If Putin wins in Ukraine, he won't stop there, and other malign actors will be emboldened. That's why Ukraine's security is our security. That's why the UK will stay the course. And it's why I'm confident that our partners share our resolve. And so far from our resolve faltering, our military support to Ukraine will increase this year. We will provide the single biggest package of defence aid to Ukraine since the war began, worth £2.5 billion. This will include more air defence equipment, more anti-tank weapons, more long-range missiles, thousands more rounds of ammunition and artillery shells, training for thousands more Ukrainian servicemen and women, and the single largest package of advanced drones given to Ukraine by any nation. All of this is on top of what we have already provided to support Ukraine. In total, since the war began, the United Kingdom will have provided almost £12 billion of aid to Ukraine. We were the first to train Ukrainian troops, first in Europe to provide lethal weapons, first to commit main battle tanks, first to provide long-range missiles, and now we are the first to keep the promise made at the last year's NATO summit, alongside 30 other countries, to provide new bilateral security commitments. Mr. Speaker, Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO, and NATO will be stronger with Ukraine in it. But these commitments will help bridge the gap until that day comes. Under the new agreement that we signed with President Zelensky, we are building Ukraine's military capabilities, and if Russia ever invades Ukraine again, we will provide swift and sustained assistance, including modern equipment across land, air and sea. Together with our allies, the UK will be there from the first moment until the last. For all of this, Mr. Speaker, I bring a message of thanks from President Zelensky to the British people. And today I hope that this House will join me in sending a message back to the Ukrainian people that we stand together as one in support of these firm commitments. Yeah. We are building a new partnership with Ukraine, designed to last 100 years or more. Yes, it's about defence and security, but it's also about trade, investment, culture, and more. And there could be no more powerful sign of our unique bond than Ukraine's decision to adopt English as the language of business and diplomacy. And so through the British Council, we're going to fund English language training for the Ukrainian people. Yeah. So, Mr. Speaker, in dangerous times, we are investing in defence, hardening our critical infrastructure, building our alliances, and we are resolute in our principles. International security, the rule of law, and freedom to determine your own future. An attack on those principles is an attack on everything that we believe in and on which our lives and livelihoods depend. As the home of parliamentary democracy and a leader in collective security, it is our responsibility to defend those principles and to defend our people. That is who we are. That is what Britain does and will always do. And I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Prime Minister for the secure briefing last week and for advance copy of his statement. Mr. Speaker, let me reiterate that Labour backs this targeted action to reinforce maritime security in the Red Sea. We strongly condemn the Houthi attacks that are targeting commercial ships of all nationalities, putting civilians and military personnel in serious danger, including British forces. The Houthi attacks are unacceptable, illegal, and, if left unaddressed, could lead to a devastating rise in the cost of essential food in some of the poorest countries. And, Mr. Speaker, the international community clearly stands against the Houthi attacks. Alongside the UK and the US, 4 other countries were involved in non-operational support. Over a dozen nations are part of the Maritime Protection Force in the Red Sea, and many others support the recent UN Security Council resolution, which condemns the Houthi attacks in the strongest possible terms. The UK strikes were limited, targeted, and did everything possible to protect civilian lives. That is a proportionate response. Mr. Speaker, military action must, of course, always be underpinned by a clear strategy, and it's the role of this House to ask the right questions. So I ask the Prime Minister, what confidence does he have that his stated objectives have been met? What process will he follow
in the face of continued Houthi attacks? What efforts are underway to maintain the support of the international community? And can he confirm that he stands by the Parliamentary Convention that, where possible, military interventions by the UK government, particularly if they're part of a sustained campaign, should be brought before this House? Scrutiny is not the enemy of strategy. Because while we back the action taken last week, these strikes still do bring risk. We must avoid escalation across the Middle East. So can the Prime Minister also tell us how the UK will work with international partners so that our rightful actions are not used as an excuse by those who seek to expand violence throughout the wider region, or indeed reanimate the conflict in Yemen itself? Nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, our armed forces across the region are showing the highest professionalism and bravery, both in defending commercial shipping and this targeted action. We thank them, we are proud of them. They continue to show that Britain is a force for good. As does, Mr. Speaker, the UK's unwavering unity in support of Ukraine and against Russian aggression. On these benches, we have backed all military support. So again, we back the Prime Minister's announcement of £2.5 billion for Ukraine next year. And we strongly support the agreement on security cooperation. This will give Ukraine vital confidence to plan for the year ahead. I hope it becomes a template for other allies to follow, and that Ukraine, in time, will become a full member of NATO. Because, Mr. Speaker, to those listening in Kyiv, Moscow, or elsewhere in the world, let me be clear. Whoever is in government in Britain, the UK will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Returning to the Middle East, it is now over 100 days since the brutal events of October the 7th. Israel's right to self-defence is fundamental, as is its duty to comply with international law. And the longer this conflict in Gaza rages, the more the risk of escalation throughout the entire region. On the Israel-Lebanon border, we must urge constraint. We must make it crystal clear to all parties that the UK does not support this conflict extending further in Lebanon. While within Israel and Palestine, in the West Bank, settler violence must stop immediately. And in Gaza, we need a humanitarian truce now, not as a short pause, but as the first step on a road away from violence. The need for a sustainable ceasefire is clear: to stop the killing of innocent civilians, to create the space for the return of all the hostages, and to provide urgent humanitarian relief, to protect against disease and ward off a devastating famine. Mr. Speaker, from that first step, we can begin a bigger push towards peace, a permanent end to the fighting, and a lasting political solution. The hope of the two-state solution is fragile, but it is still there, and we must fight for it, just as we must also remain resolute in the face of aggression which threatens global security, whether that's in Europe or the Red Sea. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his support of the action that we've taken? And I think he's absolutely right to highlight the international coalition that over recent weeks has called out the Houthis' behaviour, culminating in the UN Security Council resolution strongly condemning the attacks, which he rightly referenced. Our stated aim was to degrade and disrupt the Houthis' capability to launch attacks like this on civilian shipping. As I indicated, our initial assessment that those strikes that we conducted have been successful in the specific targets that were selected during the strikes. Obviously, that's an initial assessment, but that remains our case at the moment. And more generally, what we want to see is a reduction of tensions in the region and a restoration of stability. That is our stated aim. It's incumbent on the Houthis not to escalate this and continue with what are illegal and unprovoked attacks on civilian shipping, putting innocent lives at risk and damaging the global economy and the prices that British citizens and others will pay for their everyday goods, as the honourable gentleman rightly pointed out. I can assure him that it was necessary to strike at speed, as he acknowledged, to protect the security of these operations. That is in accordance with the Convention, and I remain committed to that Convention and would always look to follow appropriate processes and procedures, and also act in line with precedent, where he will know there have been strikes in 2015 and 18 where a similar process as to this was followed. And I can also provide him with the assurance, as he rightly asked, about our international engagement, because there will be malign forces out there that seek to distort our action, to turn it into something that it is not, and it is important that we engage with our allies and those others in the region so they understand what we did and why. And I can provide him with the assurance that we have done that, will continue to do that, because it is important that there is no linkage between these actions and anything else that is happening. This is purely and simply to respond in self-defence to illegal attacks by the Houthis on commercial shipping. And I also welcome his support for the announcements we made with regard to Ukraine. He is again right to point out the importance of the security commitments that we have signed. 30 countries at the Vilnius summit promised to do so, and again this House should be proud that it's again the United Kingdom leading by being the first country to sign such a commitment, and which I now believe will serve as a template for others to follow. And I can tell him the enormous appreciation in Ukraine for the UK to do that, so that there is a long-term certainty for the Ukrainian people of our support, and providing further deterrence to Russia and others against future aggression. I think perhaps in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the confluence of these two events over the same 24 hours serves to highlight the increasing threats that we face as a country. The global environment is becoming more challenging, more unstable, and it is incumbent on us to respond to those challenges with increased investment in defence, as we are doing, strengthening our alliances, because ultimately we must defend the principles of international law, of freedom and democracy, freedom of navigation that we all hold dear, and this government will always stand ready to do that and to protect the British people.
Sir Julian Lewis.
The Prime Minister was clearly absolutely justified to respond as he did, particularly after the direct attack against HMS Diamond. But given that at the time of the Falklands campaign, we had 35 frigates and destroyers and were spending 4.5% of GDP on defence, whereas both those figures can be cut in half to describe our situation today, does he agree with me that we certainly should not be reducing the numbers of frigates or destroyers, and we certainly should not be mothballing or otherwise decommissioning our amphibious assault ships?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm happy to reassure my honourable friend that our intention is to increase defence spending from where it currently is up to 2.5% when the circumstances allow. It's worth reminding the House that we have consistently over the past decade been the second largest spender on defence in NATO, larger than 20 other countries combined, and our plans will continue to provide that leadership. Within that, there is a very strong equipment plan underpinned by the £24 billion extra that the MOD received in its most recent settlement, which for the Royal Navy does include Type 26, Type 31 and Type 32 frigates. And with regard to the specific vessels that he talked about, the Defence Secretary has asked the First Sea Law to plan how the Royal Marine's excellent work can be taken forward so that they have the capabilities that they need to continue their work and to be able to be deployed globally. And when that process concludes, of course, the Defence Secretary will update the House.
SNP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by echoing the Prime Minister's sentiments in relation to Ukraine. All of us on these benches remain firmly united behind their struggle against Vladimir Putin's Russia. Mr. Speaker, when Sir Walter Scott wrote that in war both sides lose, I'm not quite sure he'd factored into the equation the likes of the Houthis, because they are, of course, the fundamentalists' fundamentalists. and unperturbed by the bombing that they have been on the receiving end of from Saudi Arabia for many years. The perceived wisdom would suggest that they are perhaps not just content, but maybe even quite happy to be on the receiving end of American bombs. And it is in that context that that poses an enormous question for all of us in this House as to what comes next. If, as has been suggested through their actions over the course of the last 12 hours or so, the message which we sought to send has not been received, then what do we intend to do? What is the plan? What is the Prime Minister's strategy? Will he come to the dispatch box and, unlike his predecessors in relation to Middle East conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, lay out when and how far he is willing to go in relation to military action? Because quite clearly, we need to understand his government's strategy in this conflict, because we cannot have an escalation which leads to further regional instability. And of course, whilst we would all agree, quite rightly, that we should not fall for the Houthis' narratives that this is directly related to the conflict in Israel and Gaza, we cannot escape from the fact that a ceasefire in Gaza is essential for that wider regional stability. And finally, Mr. Speaker, whilst the Prime Minister has sought to defend his decision not to come to the House last week, it is quite clear that this House should have been recalled. It is what the public would have expected, and I would urge him to do better in future.
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments about Ukraine and support for our approach. With regard to the future, I obviously won't speculate on future action. What we conducted was intended as a single limited action, and of course we hope that the Houthis will now step back and end their reckless and destabilising attacks. But of course, Mr. Speaker, we will not hesitate to protect our security and our interests where required, and we would of course follow the correct procedures, as I believe we did so in this case. And although the honourable gentleman is right to ask questions, but we should also recognise the risks of inaction. Because doing nothing would absolutely weaken international security and the rule of law. It would further damage the freedom of navigation and the global economy. And perhaps most importantly, it would send a very dangerous message that British vessels and British interests are fair game, and that is simply unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. And lastly, if I might say, and of course I'm happy to answer questions about the situation in Israel and Gaza, but this House should be very clear in making it clear to the outside world that there is no linkage between what we have done last week and the situation in Israel-Gaza. This was a specific action in self-defence against the Houthis, who are conducting illegal strikes against innocent civilian shipping, and that has nothing to do with what is going on in Israel-Gaza, and we must never let anyone think that this House believes that there is.
Richard Drax.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, for his excellent and wide-ranging speech this morning. He rightly pointed out that we face dangerous times. And can I ask my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, that while it's important how we spend defence money, it is vital and without doubt that defence needs a lot more money, more than 2.5% in these arbitrary targets, if our brave men and women are going to fight a sustained conflict in the years ahead.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree that the Defence Secretary did make an excellent speech earlier, and in that speech he highlighted, as I did, that defence spending has consistently met our NATO obligation. We've been the second largest defence spender in NATO, and in the last settlement, defence received the largest increase of £24 billion since the end of the Cold War, because my friend is right, the threats that we face are increasing. It's right that we invest to protect the British people against those threats, and that is exactly what this government is doing and will continue to do.
Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While not having a vote in this House is regrettable, Liberal Democrats support limited strikes against the Houthis to open international shipping lanes. But we cannot lose sight, Mr. Speaker, of the fact this region is a tinderbox. Attacks on US soldiers in Syria and Iraq, the terrorism of Islamic State in Iran, the rockets of Hezbollah, the Israeli drone strikes in Beirut, all stemming from the horrifying conflict in Israel and Gaza. So can the Prime Minister set out what conversations he has had with our NATO and European allies, but also leaders of Gulf countries, to ensure that these limited strikes remain limited?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course, as I said, we are extensively engaging with our international partners, including our Gulf allies. I recently spoke to the President of Egypt just last week and will continue to do so. But again, I say this, it's important that no one takes away that this House believes on any side that there is a linkage between direct action in self-defence against the Houthis and the situation in Israel-Gaza. They are entirely distinct. We will do everything we can to bring more aid into Gaza, to make sure that we work hard for a sustainable ceasefire, and that is separate to our ability and necessary duty to defend our interests and our people.
Sir Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister for his firm and principled response to events in the Red Sea? But with their support for Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis, is it not clear that Iran will do anything to stop lasting peace between Arab states and Israel, because the Iranian regime believes that Israel should not exist at all?
That's right.
Is not a real defeat for Iran to see them isolated by meaningful resolution of the Palestinian issue, the supercharging of the Abraham Accords process to bring peace and stability to the region, all underpinned by international resolve to confront Iran's proxies wherever they threaten our interests and our values?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his excellent remarks, but also for the work that he does on the Abraham Accords, which has done much to bring more peace and stability to the region. And he's right that the behaviour of the Iranian regime poses a significant threat to the safety and security of the UK and our allies, and ensures regional instability where we want to see more peace and stability. I can assure him that we are keeping abreast of all the risks in the area, and that's why the Royal Navy last year and the year before continues, for example, to interdict illegal arms smuggling by the Iranians to the Houthis, and we will continue to keep in close contact with our allies to take all measures that we can to protect our people and ensure that the Iranians' destabilising influence in the region is reduced to the best extent possible.
Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his statement, and he's been absolutely crystal clear in the need to degrade the capabilities of this terrorist organisation, the Houthis, that are causing havoc in the Red Sea. He will also know that Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world, suffering a mass humanitarian crisis with over 21 million people in need of humanitarian need and support. Can I ask the Prime Minister, what will he do to ensure that they are not engulfed all over again, particularly the civilians of Yemen, in a mass humanitarian catastrophe?
Minister. Can I thank my honourable friend for raising an incredibly important point and reassure her in the House that, and she will know this from her own experience, that we are steadfast in our support to the Yemeni people as one of the largest donors of life-saving aid to the UN appeal. We've also committing, I believe, £88 million in this forthcoming year. Over the last several years, we've committed £1 billion, and that will help to providing food for at least 100,000 people every month and deliver life-saving healthcare through 400 facilities. The Yemeni people are suffering, and we are doing everything we can to alleviate that suffering.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this century, with the threat of access to the Suez Canal from Somali piracy, the international community united with a widely based task force to successfully suppress it. Now the Houthis are threatening the lives of seafarers and international navigation, trade and the jobs that depend on it. Will he also seek to work to get the widest possible international task force to deal with this? And will he also support the people of South Yemen who want nothing to do with these terrorists?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right about the necessity of building international coalitions. I'm pleased to say that it's happening. Operation Prosperity Guardian, which we are proud to be a partner of, is upholding freedom of navigation in the region. And as has been mentioned as well, the UN Security Council resolution that was passed on the 10th of January, I think, is instructive in this sense. It very strongly condemns, as it condemns in the strongest terms, the Houthi attacks, demands that they immediately cease all attacks, and notes the right of member states to act in accordance with international law to defend their vessels. He will also have seen the statement published by around a dozen of our allies before and after the strikes, and that will hopefully reassure him that there is broad international support for what we are doing and calls on the Houthis to desist what they are doing.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
I represent a constituency with a proud maritime tradition, and families are anxious for commercial shipping staff whose jobs take them through the Red Sea. A scramble towards military action is endangering UK seafarers in the Red Sea. Maritime unions are calling for not just more protection, but they stress the need for coordinated diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis. After today's attack on a ship, can he explain to seafarers how dropping bombs will lead to a de-escalation of a situation which is already endangering their safety?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's quite extraordinary. It is Houthi rockets that are endangering the lives of British seafarers in the region. And actually, what we have seen, as you've seen from shipping companies who have welcomed the action that we have taken, because they are keen to see security and stability restored to the region, and that is what we are aiming to do, to disrupt and destabilise the Houthis' ability and degrade their ability to carry out these attacks, restore stability to the region. That is very much the focus of our attention. We're acting in self-defence to protect the lives of seafarers, not endanger them, and she would do well to call out the Houthis to stop what they're doing.
Sir Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that the international law case for the action his government has taken in the Red Sea was, unusually in my experience, relatively straightforward? But would you also agree that the next significant challenge is to maintain and enhance a multinational consensus in deterring and combating more of these attacks if they occur? And would he accept that acting in compliance with and respectful of international law assists us in that task?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his question, and he is right, and hopefully he will have seen the published legal summary of our advice on this issue. This was proportionate and necessary action taken lawfully to respond to attacks by the Houthis, and they were the only feasible means to do so. And the UK is, as he knows, permitted under international law to use force in such circumstances. It's right that we have regard for the legal advice in such situations, and I can reassure him that we will continue to always have regard to it. While we are fighting to protect international law, it's important that we also follow it ourselves.
Amsana Begum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 71% of the British public want a ceasefire in Israel-Gaza. That's according to a latest YouGov poll taken just last month. Yet last week, the government launched airstrikes in the Red Sea, an escalation of the situation in the Middle East. I understand that the government may not have been under any constitutional obligation to take a parliamentary vote on this particular military action, or indeed abide by a result of that vote, should it have even decided to take one. But does the Prime Minister believe it has any duty towards, the government has any duty towards the British public when making such decisions, and to the parliamentary community who represent the British people in building any political support for this military action?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition made the point in his remarks, rightly, that we need to make sure that malign actors elsewhere would not try and distort what we have done for their own purposes. But I would gently say to the Honourable Lady to conflate and link our action against the Houthis with the situation in Israel-Gaza just gives ammunition to our enemies who would seek to make things worse in the region. We have acted in self-defence. I've explained the reasons and the processes that we have followed and the accountability that I have to Parliament, which I am now here discharging. And separately, we will of course work very hard to bring humanitarian aid into Gaza and to try and bring about the sustainable ceasefire that we all, of course, want to see.
Sir Batchelor.
I commend my right honourable friend for prosecuting this military action. As a matter of law, it was highly necessary and clearly proportionate, and his legal position is watertight. Countries around the world depend on that route, but as usual it is the British and Americans who do something about protecting it. There are reports, however, this afternoon that more Houthi attacks are taking place. Will he take more military action if necessary?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his support. Of course, he'll understand that I won't speculate on future action. This was intended as limited single action, and we hope the Houthis will now step back and end their destabilising attacks. But of course, as I said earlier, we will not hesitate to protect our security, our people and our interests where required. And if we do so, we will of course follow the correct procedures and precedent as we did in this case.
Sir Christopher Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is right that Ukraine needs military support, but it also needs to be rebuilt. Last year, the government, the British government that is, opposed proposals that we should seize Russian state assets, $300 billion worth, sitting in banks around the world, including in the UK, and use them to rebuild Ukraine. The Foreign Secretary, however, I note in December in the United States of America said that he was now arguing that we should be able to seize those assets. Shouldn't we legislate to make sure that Putin pays for the reconstruction of Ukraine?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not entirely sure that I agree with the characterisation of the situation by the honourable gentleman. I agree that Russia must pay for the long-term reconstruction of Ukraine, and I've been clear about that. And actually, on the G7 leaders' call at the end of last year, I was the one who raised this issue, and as a result, we have collectively in the G7 tasked finance ministers to explore all lawful routes to ensure that Russian assets are made available for that purpose. We're working to identify all options for seizing those assets. We're doing it at pace and ensuring that those measures would be safe, robust and compliant with the international rule of law. And we are doing it in conjunction with our international allies. So I can give him all those reassurances. And again, it's the UK, together with the US, who has been leading that conversation in the G7.
Jeremy Quinn.
Houthi attacks on shipping are a global problem, and it's right that we acted alongside our partners. Where close allies did not participate in those airstrikes, we still need them to act and act alongside us. Can we encourage them to redouble their efforts to interdict arms smuggling from Iran into Yemen and therefore help to degrade further the military capacity of the Houthis?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and we will continue to work with our allies, and hopefully he will have seen the statement that was put out by around a dozen of our allies after the strikes, reiterating their support for what we have done, and he'll know that there was non-operational support from a handful of other countries, together with the much larger coalition of nations that are involved in different ways in Operation Prosperity Guardian, where other countries can play a part in interdicting Iranian shipments and bringing stability to the region and protecting international shipping. We, of course, want to work with them, and the Defence Secretary and the Foreign Secretary are having those conversations as we speak.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We live in most challenging times with instability in the Middle East, in Europe and indeed in Africa, and it's important that we have the right kind of leadership and response. We must make sure that our international shipping routes remain open. Can I ask the Prime Minister of his assessment of the degradation of the Houthis' capabilities after the action last week? And when it comes to Ukraine, we must stand united in this House that the Russians must be defeated for the aggression that they've shown, and we should remain together, united in saying once again, Slavia, Ukraine. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister talks about a sustainable settlement in Gaza. It is important that we recognise the scale of the humanitarian suffering. So can I ask the Prime Minister for an update of what we're doing to make sure that in Gaza that we deliver peace and security, and we have the hope of a better world as we come through 2024?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank my honourable gentleman for his support of the action in Ukraine? And maybe I'll just touch on his last point, in fact, because I agree with him. We're of course concerned about the devastating impact of the conflict in Gaza on the civilian population. Too many people have lost their lives already, and there is a desperate need for increased humanitarian support into Gaza. I'm pleased that the UK is playing a leading role. We've tripled our aid. Recently, the Foreign Secretary appointed a humanitarian envoy into the region to address some of the blockages, and just recently we delivered our first maritime shipment of aid into Egypt, over 80 tonnes of new aid. And when I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu, I impressed upon him obviously the importance of increasing the flow of trucks, but crucially, if we can, to open up extra crossings into Gaza so we can increase the flow of aid. We will continue to press on Israel to do that so we can bring more relief to people who are suffering a great deal.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Prime Minister for a very clear statement. It is reported that the drones being used by the Houthis are being helped by Iran. And the American Enterprise Institute has reported that Russia has given $900 million to Iran for drones. Can the Prime Minister assure the House that we are doing everything we possibly can in this country to make sure that none of this money is going through the UK financial system?
I can tell the Iran lady that she's right, and we agree with the US assessment that Iran has directly supplied and directly supported Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, providing intelligence especially to enable their targeting of vessels and providing them with missiles and UAVs. She's right that we should do everything we can to prevent that, and I can reassure her, of course, she'll know about the financial measures we've taken over the past 2 years to ensure things like transparency, beneficial ownership registers, which allow us to crack down on economic crime and money laundering, but also physically, the Royal Navy is involved in interdicting those shipments and has successfully done so last year and the year before, and will continue to have a presence in the region so we can disrupt those illegal arms flows.
Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, it's a critical time internationally, but we have a staffing crisis in our Navy. So can we do more to boost recruitment of sailors with STEM qualifications, and when will we see our Navy back up to full strength?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would say our Royal Navy is one of the top 5 in the world. It's capable of operating in all of the world's oceans simultaneously, and is one of only 2 countries to provide, or has been proven to operate 5th-generation jets from the sea. So I think we should be confident and proud of our Royal Navy. As I've talked about, we're investing in more equipment and capability going into the future. He's right to highlight some of the recruitment challenges, and the Defence Secretary highlighted these the other week, but we are doubling down on all the initiatives we had to make sure that all our armed forces have the staff that they need and the personnel they need for the future, but also that those personnel have the equipment and supplies they need in order to do their job effectively.
Ian Duncan, Sir Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I fully support my right honourable friend and welcome his statement about the action he took on the Houthi and the other statement, part of the statement about Ukraine. We must support Ukraine in their future. But can I just bring back to the reality about the Houthi? Iran, we know, has supported, supplied and continues to direct the Houthi in their attacks. We know that Iran has supported and directed Hamas in their brutal attacks in October. We know that Iran has armed and directs Hezbollah on a regular basis and tells them what to do through the IRGC. And all of that we understand. But can I ask my right honourable friend why it is we still are reluctant to prescribe the IRGC, who are responsible for so much of the coordination of this work, and we still sit with 2 Iranian banks in the City of London feeding their money across to these terrible organisations?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend particularly for the work he personally does in supporting Ukraine, and I agree with him about the risk that Iran poses to both UK but also regional stability. We have sanctioned more than 400 Iranian individuals and entities, including the IRGC in its entirety. I'd also say that the National Security Act of last year implements new measures to protect the British public. It's been described by intelligence chiefs as game-changing, particularly tackling espionage and foreign interference with tougher powers to arrest and detain people suspected of involvement in state threats. And he will know we don't routinely comment on prescription, but he will have, I hope, seen the statement today about our prescription of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is something that I know he and other colleagues have been focused on rightly in the previous years.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Prime Minister this? In that region, there are 17 million people living in hunger and food shortage. We've had years of bombardment of the people of Yemen by weapons supplied by Britain from Saudi Arabia. And we have this dreadful conflict going on in Gaza where there are 30,000 people dead or missing. Where is the comprehensive plan by the Western nations to try to bring about a comprehensive peace across the whole region, rather than pumping more and more weapons and money in to more and more conflicts, which will get worse? Does he have any hope for the future that there will be a lessening of conflict rather than the present very rapid increase in it?
Mr. Speaker, I do have hope, and that's because as we and others take action to degrade and disrupt the capability of those who are malign actors in the region, that will actually give the space for positive voices to build the peace that all of us want to see and to allow everyone to live side by side with dignity and security and opportunity. The Honourable pointed out some of the humanitarian strife that people are suffering. As I pointed out, we should be proud in this House of our record. We have committed over £1 billion of aid in Yemen since the conflict began in 2014. As I said, we are currently providing food to at least 100,000 people every month, life-saving healthcare to 400 facilities. And it's worth pointing out that Yemen is entirely reliant for food on imports largely by sea. And the Houthis' attacks are actually serving to prolong the humanitarian suffering that Yemeni people are seeing. It's disrupting the very supply of the food that both he and I and everyone in this House would want to see delivered to those people.
Blake Drummond.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and Yemen's been close to my heart, as it has been for the Right Honourable Member for Walsall South, as we were both born there. And thank you very much for all the humanitarian aid that is going there. But I would like to ask what discussions the Prime Minister has had with the Yemeni Presidential Leadership Council, and what impact does he think the strikes will have on the fragile peace process?
Prime Minister.
Can I pay tribute to my honourable friend's work in the region? That as the United Nations Security Council penholder on Yemen, the UK is continuing to use our diplomatic and political influence to support UN efforts to bring lasting peace to Yemen through an inclusive political settlement. We support the Saudi-Houthi negotiations and indeed the deal that was announced in December of last year by the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, who she will know, and ministers continue to be in dialogue, particularly with our Saudi partners, so that we can try and bring the peace and stability to the Yemeni people that they deserve.
Lynn Brown.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Prime Minister also for stating today that the UK sought to uphold international law and seek to protect civilians with the recent strikes. Can I ask what the government's strategy is to prevent escalation? And also last week, the government confirmed that there are currently no RAF aid flights or Royal Navy deliveries planned to take essential aid into Egypt and onwards to Gaza. Why?
Prime Minister.
I'm not entirely sure that that's right, and I can say to the Honourable Lady we remain committed to increasing the amount of aid that we get into Gaza. We've tripled the financial amount, and as I said, most recently we saw our first maritime shipment of aid into Egypt, where a UK military ship, RAF Lyme Bay, was able to deliver that. We know, and she will be aware, that there are considerable blockages and logistical challenges on the ground, which we are working to help resolve, which is also why we're putting pressure on the Israelis. I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu about this, about opening up additional crossings like Kerem Shalom, so that would help us increase the flow of aid into the region. We absolutely want to see that happen.
Charlie Sholbrook.
Mr. Speaker. Britain does have a very proud tradition of defending waterways, and does my right honourable friend agree with me that actually for all of us who care about humanitarian crisis and aid, that with Russia's action in stopping grain as much as it can coming out of Turkey, past Turkey, and the potential of the Houthis shutting off the access into the Red Sea, that is absolutely vital that we keep these international waterways open, otherwise we will be facing a catastrophic situation of starvation across many African countries.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and particularly about the Black Sea. He'll recall that Ukraine's grain exports disproportionately go to some of the most vulnerable countries in the world. Russia has started a campaign of targeting that civilian infrastructure last year. With our support, they have now able to push back the Black Sea fleet, degrade Russia's major combatant vessels, and again, with the support of the City of London in improving the insurance of those ships, we have now seen 300 ships export 10 million tonnes of cargo through the new Ukraine corridor. It highlights the importance of what he's saying, and again, in this House, we should be proud of the leading role that the UK has had in making that possible.
Alex Davis-Jones.
The Houthis are an anti-Semitic terrorist group that have caused havoc in Yemen over the past decade, starting a civil war that has killed over 350,000 people. Its slogan includes the lines, "Death to America, death to Israel, a curse upon the Jews." Would the Prime Minister join me in condemning the shameful pro-Houthi chanting that we saw at many protests in the UK over the weekend?
Can I commend the Honourable Lady for her remarks, and can I wholeheartedly agree with her. We will absolutely not tolerate that kind of language on our streets. We have been crystal clear about that. We have said to the police that they should take all decisive action against those that promote and encourage terrorism, and indeed those that incite hatred and division on our streets. She will have, I hope, seen the prescription of Hizb ut-Tahrir today, another organisation which uses language similar to what she says. They absolutely, their promotion of terrorism is rooted in anti-Semitic ideology. I hope that gives her reassurance that we will confront this and stamp it out wherever we see it, because it's not in accordance with British values, and Jewish people in this country deserve to be able to walk our streets in freedom and security.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's decision last week to take military action in the Red Sea, and also the substantial increase in aid for Ukraine. But could you just take this opportunity to reiterate and make it absolutely clear, it would be utterly against the national interest and indeed the security interests of the world for the British Prime Minister to be hobbled in the decisions he makes about taking military action by the need to consult in advance. Does he not agree that that responsibility that he bears is intrinsic to his seals of office and it should not be given up?
Minister.
I'll thank my honourable friend for his comments, and in this case it was necessary to strike with speed and protect the security of the operations, and I believe that is in accordance with the Convention and indeed precedent on these matters, and I believe that he's right. The government does need to protect the security and interests of the United Kingdom. That means sometimes you do have to act decisively, quickly and securely, and fundamentally we need to maintain the prerogative powers that allow the executive to act in such emergencies. But of course, I am responsible for those decisions. I do not take them lightly, and Parliament is responsible for holding me to account for them.
Zara Sultan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Past mistakes in the Middle East should have taught this House that military intervention starting out as limited can quickly escalate, risking a sequence of events far larger and more terrible, and risk even dragging us into war. It is for this reason, according to reports in the Times, that Foreign Office officials were, and I quote, incredibly nervous about last week's military assault in Yemen. Driving the region's instability is Israel's horrifying assault on Gaza, which has now lasted more than 100 days. So rather than giving Israel the green light to continue its brutal bombardment of Gaza and risking a wider conflict, will the Prime Minister seek to de-escalate the situation and call for an immediate ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Perhaps the Honourable Lady would do well to call on Hamas and the Houthis to de-escalate the situation.
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Too many people give a free pass to the terrorists who perpetrated the worst murder of Jews, and we've just seen an example of that, just as we saw examples of that on our streets this weekend, where people screamed, "Yemen, Yemen, turn another ship around." Completely unacceptable. One thing that links the Houthis, Hezbollah and Hamas is their genocidal intent toward Jews and their hatred of everything we stand for in the Western democracies, which is why it is incumbent upon us to defend those values. So can I agree with everything the Prime Minister has said, and can I urge him once more to make sure our police are taking action against those who on our street openly support terrorism?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I reassure my honourable friend that the police do have extensive powers to arrest those who incite violence or racial hatred. Of course, we keep all laws under review. We're working with the police whether we need to strengthen those powers, but I've been absolutely clear that there must be zero tolerance for anti-Semitism and any forms of racism. We will not stand by when we see that happen, and the police should make sure that those who do that face the full force of the law.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary said yesterday that the purpose of the airstrikes in Yemen was to send a message. But the message that we intend to send isn't necessarily the message that gets received. And the message seems to have been sent to many in the region that the UK is intervening in the war very clearly on the side of Israel. So what plans does the government have to manage and contain the escalation that is likely to ensue? Because simply proclaiming that this activity was intended to be limited, not escalatory, does not make it so.
And that's why we took this action as a last resort after extensive attempts at diplomacy, including a UN Security Council resolution. And again, the Honourable Lady could help, because this Parliament can speak with one voice that the outside world and our allies in the region know that this does have nothing to do with Israel and Gaza and has everything to do with our self-defence.
Sarah Atherton.
Speaker, diverting shipping via the Cape is a financial burden for us all, no more so than the Egyptians due to reduced traffic through the Suez Canal. So can my right honourable friend explain what discussions he's had with his Egyptian counterparts over their involvement in this multinational response?
Prime Minister.
Well, I spoke to President Sisi just last week. She's right to highlight the economic impact on people around the world. 15% of global trade passes through this corridor, and we are already starting to see the impact of rerouting on the prices of shipping and ultimately on the prices that British people will pay for their goods. My primary conversation with the President at the moment, though, is about increasing the flow of aid into Gaza, where Egypt is doing an extraordinary amount, and we will continue to give them every support that they need.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister said that the stated aims of this action was to degrade the capacity to strike. We have had confirmation that today another cargo ship, a US cargo ship, has been struck by a ballistic missile. There have been explosions at the Yemeni port of Houthis. The Defence Secretary told the media this morning that this government was prepared to take the decisions that need to be taken if the attacks continue. Given this news that the attacks have continued, can the Prime Minister set out for us what those decisions are and how he intends to involve Parliament in that process?
Mr. Speaker, it wouldn't be right to speculate on future action, but what I can say is our strikes were intended to degrade the Houthi capability, and as I said, they did, initial assessments show, effectively destroy 13 targets at 2 sites, including drones, an airfield and a cruise missile launcher.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, as co-chair of the all-party Yemen group with my honourable friend from Meon Valley, we've seen at first hand how this brutal, misogynistic, homophobic, anti-Semitic terrorist regime backed by Iran, presiding over the world's greatest humanitarian crisis and responsible for throwing tens of thousands of young men to their deaths in the front line, have acted. Since 2022, they've benefited from a tentative ceasefire. So is this not a lesson in how you cannot achieve sustainable ceasefires with terrorist organisations unless and until they have been deprived of their arms and succumbed to democratic legitimacy?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank and pay tribute to my honourable friend's work in Yemen and very simply agree with him and say that he makes an excellent point.
John MacDonald.
I appreciate why the Prime Minister's not trying to link this to Gaza, but the reality is the longer the Gaza war goes on, the greater the instability in the Middle East will take place. It's nearly 100 days since he gave his first statement after the terrible, horrendous actions by Hamas. And he justified the actions this week with regard to protection of maritime rights. In that 100 days, 7,000 Palestinian children have been killed. What effective action is he taking to protect the right to life of Palestinian children? And what effective action is he taking to prevent what is in reality the indiscriminate killing of Palestinian children by the Israeli Defence Force?
Hear, hear.
Prime Minister.
Mr Deputy Speaker, as I said, we are deeply concerned about the devastating impact of the fighting in Gaza on the civilian population. Too many people have lost their lives already, and that is why we continue to call for international humanitarian law to be respected and for civilians to be protected. It's something that I continually raise with Prime Minister Netanyahu when I speak to him, and it is why we're doing absolutely everything we can to get more aid into Gaza to help those children and everyone else affected by what is happening.
Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Could I very much welcome this robust statement, but also agree with proscribing the IRGC. Operationally, given the continued threat to international shipping and by extension to our own economy, will he consider tasking the carrier group, which is ready to deploy from Portsmouth to the Gulf? And more strategically, does he agree that interruption to our global supply chains underlines the symbiotic relationship between our security and the UK economy? If we are rightly to seek to play a greater role in upholding international law as our world becomes ever more contested, we do need to expedite upgrading our defence posture, not least in the maritime space.
Well, Mr Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very good point about the interconnectedness of the world, the instability that we see, whether it's in the Red Sea or indeed the illegal war conducted in Ukraine by Russia, have had a direct impact on the economic security of British people here at home. That's why it's right that we invest in defence, protect people, and that's why I know he will continue to engage in dialogue with the Defence Secretary at how best to deploy that extra defence investment to make sure that we have the capabilities that we need.
Order. Order. If everybody could resume their seats. We've already done an hour, and it looks to me as if there's still a considerable number of people who want to get in. So please can I ask you to focus on shorter questions in order that I can help you to get in.
Thank you very much.
Brendan O'Hara.
Deputy Speaker, the right of innocent passage is a fundamental principle of international law, and it cannot be interrupted by non-state actors. And although he may wish it wasn't the case, international law isn't a menu. It comes as a package, and we cannot pick and choose what bits we want to uphold and what bits we want to ignore. So the Prime Minister unable to see how ignoring Israel's egregious breaches in Gaza, while purporting to act in defence of it in Yemen, actually undermines international law and the rules-based order.
No, Mr Speaker. Israel has the right to act in self-defence against Hamas, which conducted a terrorist attack on them, and we continue to call for international humanitarian law to be respected and for civilians to be protected in that conflict.
Sir Robert Buckland.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think this House should be in no doubt that conflating issues relating to Israel and Hamas is not a mature way to look at the problem that the Prime Minister had to look at last week. He's made the right decision on the evidence in accordance with law. The question would have been, had he failed to take that action, then he would be, I think, exposed to justifiable criticism in this House. In light of that approach that he's taking, with regard to Ukraine, and the work that we are doing to work with the Ukrainian government, will more be done to make sure that we can help our friends in Ukraine develop further their justice processes, which I think will, in the long term, improve the good governance of that independent country.
Prime Minister. Can I thank my honourable friend? He makes an excellent point, and I'm pleased to tell him that the Attorney General is deeply involved in the work that he suggests, and we're particularly supporting the work of the Office of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine, but more generally the agreement that I just signed with President Zelensky ensures our mutual commitment to help him reform the administration and public administration in Ukraine, something that he's passionate and keen to do, and he will have our support in doing so.
Stephen Doty.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister has heard the support for limited targeted action against the Houthis, and I know when I listened carefully to what he said about the efforts to prevent civilian casualties, which was unfortunately an issue I had to raise many times in relation to the previous conflict in Yemen. But can he say, therefore, a bit more about what we are practically doing to ensure they are tightly targeted against Houthi military capabilities. And of course, he rightly made the point about that those are being done to protect civilian shipping. But could he say a little bit more on what we're doing to prevent civilian casualties?
Minister.
Mr Deputy Speaker, we obviously, the Honourable Gentleman will respect that we don't comment in depth on the choice of targets. We do use carefully calibrated intelligence in conjunction with our military partners. The targets were selected specifically to degrade military capabilities and narrowly focused on taking out military hardware which can be used to attack commercial shipping, and I can give them the reassurance that every effort was made to minimise civilian casualties, and indeed our initial assessment says that that has been successful.
Raymond Shishti.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Foreign Secretary said over the weekend that the world is in the most dangerous position it has been in decades. The UK has seen military deployments in Ukraine, Kosovo, Guyana, now the Red Sea. It is absolutely crucial to ensure that our armed forces have the appropriate support and resources they need. The Prime Minister has said the government is committed to an aspiration of 2.5% spending on defence. An aspiration. When does the Prime Minister see that aspiration becoming a reality? And will the government now further look at increasing that to 3% in line with the Foreign Secretary's statement over the weekend that the world is in the most dangerous situation it has been in decades?
Mr Speaker, we have been investing in anticipation that the threats were increasing, and that's why at the last spending review the Defence Department received a £24 billion cash increase, the largest sustained increase since the end of the Cold War. Since then, we've invested an extra £5 billion in increasing stockpiles and in improving the sustainability of our nuclear defence nuclear enterprise. And in 2025, when we have the next spending review, we will, of course, set out the target and the path towards 2.5%.
Jim Shannon.
Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister very much for his statement, and assure the Prime Minister that the Democratic Unionist Party will stand with him and with our government in sending the clear message to those who would seek to attack either our shipping routes or only attacking our position. We will not be silenced by those who believe they can work in the shadows to supply Yemen or indeed any other country with intelligence or arms. Will the Prime Minister affirm that the friendship and approach between the United Kingdom, United States of America, Australia, Canada and many other nations remain strong enough to stand together against any attempt to undermine our current position? Thank you.
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his support, and he's right about the importance of working with our allies, and he will have seen, I think, all the countries he mentioned as joint signatories of the statement that was put out in advance and after the strikes.
Sir Edward Lee.
Of course we have a right to defend ourselves, and of course sinister forces such as the Houthis in Iran are exploiting these tensions. But just as we have influence on the Americans because we step up to the mark, can my right honourable friend work with the American president to ensure that just as he is completely vigorous in defending Israel and their right to exist, he is even as vigorous in defending the right of the Palestinian people to their own state in peace and justice without a settlement being imposed on them every week?
Prime Minister. Well, can I say to my honourable friend that we do want to see the long-term future of a two-state solution where Palestinian and Israeli people can live side by side in security, in freedom and with dignity and opportunity. That is the future that we're all striving for, and the events of the last few months have just reminded us that we need to double our efforts on making that happen.
Nick Whitley.
Thank you. I regard with the utmost seriousness the threat posed by Houthi forces to mariners in the Red Sea. But does the Prime Minister accept that upholding the right to freedom of navigation in the region is an international challenge that should be dealt with through international diplomacy, principally aimed at securing a sustainable ceasefire in Gaza, and that by joining in US-led military action without reference to the UN, we're in danger of exacerbating the threat posed to British citizens by terrorism?
Again, the Honourable Gentleman has wrongly linked and conflated the situation in Israel and Gaza with the illegal attacks by the Houthis on innocent commercial shipping. That is simply wrong, and as I pointed out in my statement, there had been extensive diplomatic avenues pursued before military action was taken as a last resort, including a UN Security Council resolution.
Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister upon his action? He's acted clearly upon robust legal advice, and the legal position in international law is surely clear. Would he agree that A, it is unhelpful and frankly dangerous to make bogus comparisons, and secondly, to recognise that going forward, the greatest risk of escalation will be to fail to act robustly when clear and egregious breaches of international law take place.
Can I thank my honourable friend? I agree with everything he said, and he's absolutely right that there is a risk in inaction, and to have done nothing in the face of these attacks would have been to damage the security of our people and our interests.
Boone Thompson.
I welcome the Prime Minister's commitment to protecting fundamental tenets under international law and upholding fundamental principles of United Nations. But could I ask the Prime Minister, is that as equally distinct and limited to this action as it is to all other situations?
Prime Minister.
Again, so I didn't completely follow what the honourable gentleman was saying, but I said our actions in this case were specific to the case at hand. We acted in self-defence because there was escalating attacks from the Houthis, and in defiance of international diplomacy, it was right that we took action to protect the security and interests of our people.
Jack Lepresti.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now, given the global shortage of basic ammunition, artillery rounds and air defence systems and missiles, isn't it time that we really upscaled our industrial defence capacity so we can continue to support our friends in Ukraine and replenish our own stocks?
Excellent point. In a word, yes. That's why we've invested $2.5 billion in rebuilding our stockpiles. But beyond the money, we do need to actually just build our defence industrial capability. This is a shared challenge across NATO, something that I've extensively discussed with partners, including the NATO Secretary General. But of course, part of our agreement with Ukraine is how we can mutually help support and grow our defence industrial complexes.
Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The death and destruction in Gaza is intolerable, with well over 20,000 children and innocent civilians already killed by Israeli forces, more than 100 Israeli hostages still held by Hamas, and the real risk of an escalating wider regional conflict. We desperately need an end to the violence. So can the Prime Minister explain exactly what diplomatic progress he has achieved towards securing a sustainable ceasefire and peace in Gaza?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for, I think, being the first member opposite to actually remind the House that Hamas still holds 100 Israeli hostages. And it's good that he pointed that out. And he's right, we are continuing to do everything we can to bring about that sustainable ceasefire, whether it's working with the Qataris and others to secure the release of hostages and put more aid into Gaza, because I want to see what he wants to see. No one wants to see this conflict go on for a moment longer. It must be a sustainable ceasefire, and that's what we will work hard to bring about.
Stephen Crabb.
Deputy Speaker, the IAEA recently confirmed that Iran is once again ramping up its uranium enrichment activities and to near weapons grade. So in welcoming today's statement and the action that we've taken, can I urge my right honourable friend to give the House his assurance that he and his counterparts amongst our allies aren't losing sight of the really big question about whether Iran should be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, and whether he's considered whether it's the right time to activate the snapback sanctions provisions of the JCPOA.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. To say to my right honourable friend, there is absolutely no credible civilian justification for enrichment at the levels that the IAEA has reported in Iran. We are determined that Iran must not develop a nuclear weapon, and we are actively considering next steps with our international partners. That means all diplomatic tools, but including, as he said, using the snapback mechanism if necessary.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We all stand behind Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression, but does the Prime Minister accept that if we believe that the UK's security is important in relation to Ukraine, that we do accept that we are giving relatively less than other countries such as Germany? Can and should we be doing more?
So we should be proud of our record. We've been one of the largest contributors to the effort in Ukraine. But it's also important to recognise that we have consistently been the first country to act, and that has galvanised others. And that is an important role that Ukrainians especially recognise. I went through the capabilities that was true for, but again, crucially, we were the first country out of the 30 that promised to sign a security commitment. And as others follow, that will enhance and improve Ukraine's deterrent against Russia, and again it's something that we should be proud of.
Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister here opening himself up to democratic scrutiny, but can I also welcome the fact that he took the decision to act and took that heavy duty and responsibility before coming to this House, and it is folly to ask for a vote in advance of action, and it is in our national security that the Prime Minister can act, and that precedent goes a long way back, well before 2015 and 2018, the precedents he cites, but is the constitutional basis on which we defend ourselves as a country.
Prime Minister. Can I thank my honourable friend for his support and his comments? And he's right, this is not a decision that I took lightly, and he was right to point out that publicising an action like this in advance could undermine the effectiveness of it and risk the lives. Of course, it's Parliament's responsibility to hold me to account for such decisions, but it is my responsibility as Prime Minister to make those decisions.
Harry Sherman.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister may not be aware that, or perhaps he is aware that I am not the greatest expert on international relations, but I am a person that was born on August the 17th, 1940, when the German bombers were falling all over and I was sheltering in a shelter. And can I tell him that although I've been a Labour friend of Israel ever since I went to the London School of Economics, I don't trust Netanyahu's government, although I do support the limited action that he has announced. But could I say, as someone who was born in the Blitz, that I care very deeply about actions that might lead to an even greater conflagration in the Middle East. That is the danger. It seems to me is exactly what Putin and Iran wants. And please, let's be careful in these steps, although I do support the limited action.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments and reassure him that the action we took, I believe, was necessary, but it was limited and proportionate and in keeping with international law, and that's the approach that we will always take in such matters.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I was proud to celebrate Christmas and New Year with Huddersfield and Colne Valley's vibrant Ukrainian community once again this year, just as I have done for many years. And they told me firsthand how proud and appreciative they are of the UK's steadfast support for Ukraine. Will the Prime Minister continue to make the case not only to the British people, but to our NATO allies and international allies, why we must make sure, alongside Ukraine, that Putin's evil aggression doesn't succeed, and just remind people of what the dire consequences would be if he ever did?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. If Putin was to succeed, it would not just embolden him, but it will embolden our adversaries around the world. And that's why it's important that we continue to invest in Ukraine. And as I say to all our allies, an investment in Ukraine's security is ultimately an investment in our security. And that's why we must stand with them for as long as it takes.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Government of Japan clearly brought the resolution to the UN last week for specific reasons, and it's a very detailed resolution which was voted on. And one part of it which they think is extremely important, of course, is part which, quote, is to deal with the root causes of the conflict in relation to Yemen. So maybe could I give the Prime Minister the opportunity to reflect again on the question posed by my honourable friend, the member for Aberdeen South. What is the government's plan now to play a part in the ending of that conflict? What comes next?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I said previously, we are supportive of the Saudi-Houthi negotiations, of the deal that was announced in December by the UN Special Envoy. We've been in dialogue specifically with the Saudis on this issue, and we continue to want to see a lasting peace in Yemen brought through an inclusive political settlement.
Maggie True.
Deputy Speaker, and I commend my honourable friend on his decisive action. The threat posed by Houthi rebels to global trade demonstrates the importance of maintaining a well-resourced armed forces on land, sea and air. Given the current challenges in the recruitment and retention of service personnel, will my reputable friend consider further support for cadet units, such as those excellent ones in my constituency in Ilkeston and Long Eaton, to ensure that we have a trained supply of recruits who are ready and willing to serve?
Can I say, that's an excellent idea, and can I pay tribute to all her local cadets for the incredible job they do, and I'm sure the whole House will have experience in their own constituencies of that. And I can say we're introducing a number of ways to improve recruitment in the armed forces and look at more innovative ways to attract people into it, and I know the Defence Secretary will have heard what she said with interest.
Nadine Whittam.
Mr Deputy Speaker, military action in places such as Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya, in which the UK has played a part, has frequently resulted in unintended consequences, triggering further cycles of conflict in and around these countries. Will the Prime Minister accept that the US and the UK bombing Yemen risks escalating tensions at a time when violence is spreading in the Middle East? And will he commit to allowing Parliament to vote on any further action?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think the Honourable Lady's characterisation of what we did wasn't right. It was not bombing Yemen, it was taking targeted, limited action against Houthi military sites that were launching attacks on civilian shipping. And it's also worth, as honourable members have said, pointing out the risks of inaction, which he failed to mention, because doing nothing would send a dangerous message that British vessels, British interests and British lives are fair game, and that would be unacceptable.
I pay tribute to my right honourable friend for the action he has taken and for the leadership that he has shown. Can he tell the House what discussions he has had with key influencers and key allies in the region, such as Qatar, Egypt and others who've played a prominent part in seeking to de-escalate tensions in the area?
I can reassure my honourable friend that both I, the Defence Secretary and the Foreign Secretary, are having those conversations. I spoke to President Sisi recently, and indeed all other leaders in the Middle East towards the end of last year, and the Foreign Secretary is engaged as we speak, together with his colleagues, in extensive dialogue to make sure our allies and partners understand what we did and why, and that we remain committed to seeing a peaceful future for everyone living in the Middle East.
Deirdre Brock.
Deputy Speaker, inspectors of the International Atomic Energy Agency have been denied access to a Russian-occupied Ukrainian nuclear power station for 2 weeks and haven't yet received 2024 maintenance plans for the facility. Could he tell me what assessment the UK government has made of that situation?
Well, I think it just highlights Russia's continuing activity that is malignant and serves to cause everyone alarm, particularly when it comes to the security of nuclear power. The IAEA must have free access to all its sites that it needs to, and there's been a long-standing concern that they haven't been able to have that. We continue to call out Russian behaviour at the UN and elsewhere, and that's what we will do to make sure that they're accountable.
Anthony Magnon.
Deputy Speaker, the freedom of navigation is an uncontested right, whether it's in the South China Sea or on the Gulf of Aden. And before I was in this place, I was a shipping broker. Could the Prime Minister perhaps reassure the shipping industry, of which London remains one of the foremost capitals, that we will be able to lay on more support in terms of armed convoys through the Gulf of Aden and into the Red Sea, and that we will supply as much reassurance and equipment for the Maritime Protection Force that has been mentioned by others?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his excellent question. He'll know, I hope he will have seen the welcome response from the shipping industry, leading shipping companies who have welcomed the action we have taken to restore security to the region. And of course, we are members of Prosperity Guardian, which is something the shipping industry is keen to see, so that we can bring that safety of transit for all their client states. And we'll be in regular dialogue, as the Transport Secretary has been, with them in the coming days and weeks.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Since the outbreak of war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas, as well as the crisis in shipping security, which has now led to the UK military response to protect British interests, fighting between Hezbollah and Israel is intensifying, risking a wider escalation engulfing Lebanon, Iraq, Syria and other countries. Can the Prime Minister be more specific and tell the House exactly what he's doing, working with the US and regional partners to bring an end to the war in Gaza and stop a full-blown regional conflict that we are all very concerned about?
Mr Deputy Speaker, what we are doing is calling on Hamas and using our influence with their partners in the region to release hostages, and making sure that we get as much aid into Gaza in the interim, because we know that there's a need for it. We're concerned by the impact it's having, and again, the UK is playing a leading role in alleviating that suffering.
Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his clear statement on this necessary military action in Yemen. Can I join him in paying tribute to our brave armed forces at this time? And can the Prime Minister reaffirm that this action is important for protecting freedom of navigation and the safety of shipping, which has direct and indirect impacts both on world trade and indeed our UK economy?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to point out the impact of what's happening in the Red Sea on British families at home. 15% of global trade passes through this corridor, and as we are seeing, if they have to reroute, that will have a direct consequence on the prices that British families pay. And as we saw with the Ukraine and Russia situation, we can't ignore what is happening. We need to act to protect British people and ensure their economic security.
Adam Kaiser.
Mr Deputy Speaker, of course the Houthi rebels must stop their attacks in the Red Sea. And the Prime Minister was correct in his statement today to speak of the dire humanitarian crisis in Yemen. He's of course spoken at the dispatch box today about the aid delivery to Yemen, yet he failed to mention that successive Conservative governments, both as a cash figure and proportion of ODA, humanitarian aid to Yemen has in fact fallen since 2019. So if the Prime Minister accepts that there is a humanitarian crisis, not just in Yemen of course, but across the globe in Gaza, Ethiopia and other countries, then will his government return to 0.7%, a move that would be supported by members from across the House?
Mr Deputy Speaker, we are I think the 5th largest donor to the UN appeal in Yemen, £1 billion since the conflict started, and we're providing food for at least 100,000 people every month. It's a record that we should be proud of, the UK again leading by example and making an enormous difference around the world.
Jonathan Ginogly.
Deputy Speaker, I think it's since 1875 that the Royal Navy has had a key objective of keeping the Suez Canal open for commercial shipping. So frankly, this should have come as a surprise to no one, and I commend the Prime Minister on his decisive action in that regard. But listening to the statement today, I'm not hearing much of a connection with Gaza. What I am hearing again and again and again from questions are connections to Iran. And it's easy looking at the symptoms, but the causes also need to be looked at. And could I just ask my right honourable friend if he's going to be working with our international allies to deal with the question of Iran?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. That is where the linkage is. It's with the behaviour of the Iranian regime. We agree with the US assessments, and I can give him the reassurance that we are working closely with partners. Obviously, we're taking steps to protect ourselves here at home with the National Security Act and other measures. But of course, internationally, we want to see Iran's influence on the region create less instability, and that's why our interdiction, for example, of illegal arms shipments is so important, and we'll remain actively engaged in how we can do more.
Clive Efford.
Mr Deputy Speaker, clearly we couldn't ignore attacks on international shipping, and we were right to act with international partners, and we must continue to work to broaden that partnership in dealing with the situation as we go forwards. But having said that, can the Prime Minister say just how do we measure success of this limited engagement? How do we deem it to be safe for international shipping to return to the Red Sea? What is the end plan?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his support? I said, on its merits, the specific targets that were selected, our initial assessment is that we have been successful in destroying those, but that remains an initial assessment. We want to see what he said, which is a return of shipping safely to the region. The Transport Secretary is regularly engaging with companies about their passage, but we will continue to do everything we can to ensure that safe passage through the region, working together with our allies.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Iranian-backed Houthis are a terrorist group who have killed hundreds of thousands of Yemenis and are fighting the international recognised government in Yemen. And the action that the UK took with allies earlier last week was absolutely correct. What further efforts are being made by the government to augment and increase the already impressive international coalition that we have to make sure that more countries